Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, for today's webinar. Tuesday night, we will go over a lot of topics regarding kind of small HOAs in California. And today, we are really honored to host a really great friend of ours, Matthew Grode from Gibbs Giden. He has been in the HOA industry for many years and brings quite a extensive experience working with associations. And during this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask the questions in the Q&A section so we can address them. So without further ado, Matthew Grody, thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you for having me. Um, People who are living or managing small associations are uniquely challenged in the state of California because there are no exceptions for small communities from the requirements, the rigorous requirements of California law. And primarily that's called the Davis-Sterling Act, which is part of the California Civil Code. And the Davis-Sterling Act just deals with common interest communities, including condos, townhouses, as well as single-family home PUD type communities. And we're going to go through what some of those requirements are and what some of the duties that almost uniformly small associations don't comply with that someday come back to haunt them, whether it's underfunding or no reserves or deferred maintenance or unfair enforcement. It's a problem, and it should be you should handle it correctly, if for no other reason to limit potential liabilities. So, did you guys give out the handout that I put together so they have kind of a guideline of the agenda?
I think we just kind of gave like a general idea of what we're presenting, so I don't
Okay.
think
Okay,
they
just
got the
so I
handout
know.
yet.
Okay, well, I'm going to go in the order of that document. So the first thing I mentioned was what I just talked about was the California Davis-Sterling Act. And basically, it covers soup to nuts affairs of the association from formation, elections, meetings, membership, obligations to repair, obligations to provide disclosures, obligations to provide obtain insurance and things like that. So the Bible, if you will, for California HOAs is the Davis-Sterling Act. Now, as I said, there were no real exceptions for small associations, but at the end, I'll talk about a few things that may be of help to you to the extent that you're involved with a small association. Now, let's talk about elections first. What I find is that many smaller communities don't hold elections. Now, if you have a 4 unit or a 5 unit project and the board is comprised of 4 or 5 people, you don't need an election. But more often than not, I see 4 and 5 unit communities with 3 member boards. And that's written in your bylaws usually, sometimes in the CCNRs, sometimes in the bylaws. And I'm going to talk about the governing documents in a second. So if you have less than all of the members as directors, you must hold an election. And in most cases, it should be annually. And elections are not just simple things where you sit around and you go, hey, I want Joe or Mary to be on the board. That's not how it works. California law requires secret written ballots or electronic voting. California law also doesn't trust anybody. So they demand that an independent person, known as an inspector of elections, be appointed to receive the ballots, open the ballots, count the ballots, announce the results, and then hold the ballots and the other election materials for a year. Well, in some communities, an owner who's not running for an office can serve as the inspector. But because of the possible liability of being that person, most associations have to spend money and hire an outside inspector. And while the mailing costs may be less and the meetings may be shorter because you're only counting a few votes versus hundreds, the inspectors all have a minimum charge. And the state of California, in enacting all of these laws under the guise of helping HOAs and keeping costs down, have actually had the opposite impact and have made more things difficult for associations, particularly small ones. So keep in mind that if you're not doing elections and elections are required, you should start doing them and do them right. And again, if you need to refer to the law, look at the Davis-Sterling Act, confirm with your community manager if that's within the scope of the management agreement. I know every management company has various levels of management. Some are financial only, some are full service, some just deal with various issues a la carte. So if your management company scope includes elections, then they will help you through the process. Otherwise, you could talk to your attorney, you could talk to another qualified professional. All right, so that's elections. I see there's one question in the box. Let me just see if that relates to what we're talking about. Okay, tree roots. We'll talk about tree roots in a little while. Right now, when we get to maintenance, we'll talk about tree roots. And that was from David. Right? Okay. Then we had the next topic was required disclosures. And this is the one that's going to bust you all open, because California law mandates that even a 2-unit, a 3-unit, a 4-unit, a 6-unit community has to do annual disclosures, written disclosures. One big one is called the annual budget package. And the budget package has to include the financials of the association, the reserve studies. We're going to talk about reserve studies in a second. And the financial information for the association's operations. If you don't produce that, then there is an argument by anybody you try to enforce the governing documents against that you're not in compliance, and therefore they don't have to be in compliance. So the key is to have those annual disclosures, the annual budget package, and something called the annual policy statement prepared. These are time-consuming and detailed records, and they talk about deferred maintenance. They talk about how the assessments are calculated, whether there needs to be a special assessment, whether there needs to be an increase in the regular assessment. We're going to talk about assessments in a little bit, so hold back any questions on that. So it's very important that these disclosures go out. Another disclosure that's pretty common is when someone's selling their home and they have to make disclosures to the buyers about the affairs of the association. And the association in turn has to respond to the seller, the owner's request to provide copies of certain records. And if you don't have them, that could harm sales, and owners who are trying to sell who can't sell because of something the association didn't do could expose everybody there to potential financial liability. So you really don't want, if you're a volunteer as a board member, you want the maximum level of protection you could have. So where does that protection come from? Your governing documents provide protection for board members and officers so long as you act within the scope of your authority and you follow the law. Well, I'm telling you the law. So when you have to do annual disclosures, you have to do elections, all that. Also, there is statutory authority that says that volunteer directors of nonprofit corporations will be exempt from liability or will be defended by the association at the association's expense against any claims, again, as long as it's within their scope of being a director or an officer. So if you didn't have these protections, nobody would ever volunteer to serve on a board. So in order to encourage people, they want to make sure that the legislature want to make sure that people wouldn't be sued and wouldn't be personally exposed to liability. But all those protections are based on the presumption that the directors have followed the law. And each of the things we talk about are going to be examples of things you need to do to follow the law. Okay. Next topic was the board composition. And before I get to that, I want to spend 2 minutes talking about governing documents. So every association has a set of governing documents. There's usually something that has a name similar to Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Sometimes it's a little bit different, but that's the general gist. There are the bylaws, there are the articles of incorporation if it's a corporation, there are rules and regulations, and these days there are also election rules which are required. So, how do they vary? Well, the CCNRs are sort of the Bible of the affairs of the association. They tell you what's allowed, what's not allowed, what are the what color does your patio have to be? What could you have plants out? What are dogs, pool use, noise, parking, um, pets, pools, parking, and poop is it's all the P's. The bylaws talk about the procedure of the association. How many directors will there be? What officers will there be? How often do you have to have meetings? How long are the directors' terms of office? When is the budget required? Things that the board has to do. And then the articles of incorporation merely create the corporation that most associations are. Not every association is a corporation, most are. And by the way, under corporations law, you have another level of protection. So that's why some associations that are not incorporated, I suggest that they become incorporated to provide more protection to the owners against liabilities, trips and falls, dog bites, things like that. Okay. So we're talking about board composition. And under California law, corporations code, there must be at least, first of all, there must be a board of directors. That's not even an option. So where you can't get enough volunteers to fill all of the seats that the bylaws talk about, then you need to start knocking on doors and getting people to volunteer. If you can't get the full number in the short term, as long as you have a what's called a quorum, it's usually a majority of the directors. So if you have a 5-person board, you need 3. If you have a 3-person board, you need 2. If you have those numbers, if you've met quorum, you can operate the association. You can enter into contracts. You can write checks. You can do repairs. You can enforce the governing documents. But you have to make an effort to fill all of the seats. Now, the bad things happen when you don't have a quorum. And very often with smaller communities, there's one person who acts as the president, basically, and says, this is my fiefdom. I'll sign the contracts. I'll do the handyman work. We won't have elections. I'll make all the decisions. I'll be the manager. And in some cases, these people think they're entitled to pay because they're doing all of these other things. Don't do that. Don't get paid by your association, even if you're wearing a different hat. And we'll talk about why in a second. So it's the association has to get a board in place. And if it can't, what could happen is a receiver could be appointed by the state or the courts who will take over your association. That receiver has the power to impose higher assessments, has the power to adopt amendments without a vote. They have unlimited powers, and you lose control of your own community. So you don't want to let a receiver come into the picture. I often write letters to members of communities that say, hey, we really need volunteers, and we know you're busy, but you're going to lose control of your community unless you participate in the affairs. It doesn't take that much time. So that's a really bad thing that can happen. Other problems with small associations and small boards. What if you have an even number and there's a deadlock and then nothing happens? You need that. That's why the full board is usually an odd number. And that's why it's really important to try to have an odd number to break ties. Sometimes in the example I just gave with the one person who's running everything, unfortunately, I've seen cases where that person is also pocketing some of the assessment money for themselves. And of course, not every small association has these problems. But when somebody is doing this for 10 or 15 years, they can treat the association's money as their own. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. So you really want a full board. You want transparency, and you want to make these disclosures that I just told you about, because that's how everybody else gets to know what's going on. Okay. Um, the problem with elections, as I said earlier, is that they could be costly. If you have to hire an inspector of elections who has to prepare the secret ballots, mail the secret ballots, receive them, hold a meeting, count them, store them. Um, I've seen minimums vary, but oftentimes it could be well over $1,000 for each election. It really depends. Um, okay. Self-managed associations is a little topic I want to cover for now. Next. So oftentimes small communities say, we can't afford management. We can't afford inspector of elections. We can't afford to be incorporated. So we're just going to run it ourselves. Well, most people aren't qualified, educated in, first of all, association law. And as you're hearing, there's a lot out there to know. And then they also don't have insurance to act as a manager. So if there is a problem, if they fail to maintain a balcony and someone falls through and gets hurt, that person has personal exposure in addition to possible exposure by the association. So when you hire professional management, they typically have insurance, they have qualifications, experience, and education, and they could kind of lead you down the path of reducing liability and getting all of the requirements accomplished. But self-management is not a good idea. Again, lack of knowledge of accounting, management experience, um, legal experience, liability, and in some cases, potential criminal misconduct if they're misusing association funds. Um, okay, so if, well, I covered that one question. Okay, now
I
meetings.
guess
Yeah,
Matthew, I think before you go on, maybe I can
yeah,
chime in here. I think, because you're talking about kind of elections and kind of board seats. I mean, and you were kind of talking about some of the ways to get people in the community to fill in the seats, but what are some other like, alternative methods to encourage, people in the community? Because I think that's usually people stress like it's so hard. For example, I was talking to this small community actually yesterday, and she was saying, "Oh, I'm the only president and people don't even join the meeting. People are just not interested. They just want to have, like people obviously have life outside of the HOA,
sure,
but that person was really having a hard time just getting people to join the board or just helping out with the community. So what are
right.
some typical, I guess, kind of advice or like guidelines that you can provide for all of our small HOAs to encourage people in the community to help everyone out?
Okay, so we'll separate that into elections and meetings plus assistance. So with the elections, it's mandatory under the law. So a letter should be prepared for most communities that they can use when there's apathy and when people won't participate in the election process. If you need three candidates, if you need three directors, first you send out nomination forms, and the code has a timeline for that. Then you also send out election rules, and you then try to encourage people. You get back the nomination forms. If you don't have enough, then you send out a letter. It could be a template that someone prepares for you that says, look, this is our community. It's our largest asset. We need to protect it. And in order to do so, we have to make sure that it's maintained right, it's repaired correctly, and we're in compliance with all of the laws. And in part, that includes obtaining insurance and making certain filings with the state and making certain disclosures to the other owners. And we must have volunteers, or else, as I said earlier, a court can order a stranger to come in and take control, which is going to cost us more money, and we will have no say in the process. Usually at that point, someone says, well, how much time will it take? And you say, you know what? Per our bylaws, we have to meet once a month, maybe twice a month. It could be once a month. It depends how many issues there are. Some communities don't have a lot of issues. But there is a statutory requirement that the financials of every California association are reviewed monthly. You can review them at home, but there has to be some activity by the directors every month to make sure money's not being stolen from the bank account, that bills are being paid promptly, that your account is not running out and your assessments are too low. Then, so the real dedication of time, look, there are boards that meet daily. There's one I represent in Manhattan Beach. Every day they have some issues. It's crazy. They created these committees and committees and committees. Other ones I hear about it once a quarter. So, and it's usually nothing major. But you have to basically, it's not to scare them, but it's to educate your members and tell them we need to protect our assets and we need volunteers. Now, another way to do this is if it's really a small community, let's say it's 5 homes, and the CCNRs call for 3 board members. One way to help the process is to amend the bylaws and make everybody a director. So now you have directors and you don't have to have elections. So you just saved money, and now you have everybody can vote on everything. So with a small association, again, you want an odd number because an even number is going to cause problems. But that may be one solution. Now, in terms of your other question about how to get people involved, well, some communities to like get people to vote, for example, they have raffles, small little gift cards or free pizza. Sometimes that's an incentive. The other ways are you create committees. So maybe somebody wants to be on a social committee where they could have the 4th of July picnic and they could organize it, or they could have some other, a newsletter to tell people what's going on with the project. Hey, we're thinking about having painting next year. What do you guys think? Do surveys, get people involved, tell them what your neighboring properties' values are and whether or not you're as well priced as they are or under market because your paint is peeling and cracked and your sidewalks are lifting. And I know there's a question about tree roots, and maybe this is a good time to talk about it. And tree roots are causing damage. So by educating the people, saying, we're responsible for that landscape area, and the tree roots are damaging the foundation, and that can cause us a great expense down the road. So who wants to help us go get bids? Who wants to, involve people, create to-do lists that people could get involved with? Let me just look at the question that was asked.
Absolutely.
Are HOAs responsible for tree roots coming from the common area into a homeowner's backyard? Pine trees were planted by a developer, and they're claiming the tree roots are causing damage in their yards. We put a root barrier down in the common area to prevent further damage. Is the owner responsible to take care of existing damage in his yard? Well, the simple answer is it depends on what your CCNRs say. The general rule is that an owner is responsible for the maintenance, repair, and replacement of their lot, if it's single family, or their units, if it's like a condo or townhouse, and the association is responsible for the common elements. Now, sometimes there's gray area. So for example, and we're going to talk about tree roots, don't worry, I'm not losing my path. So sometimes in townhouse communities, for example, they may have their own roofs, they own the roof, but the association's responsible for the roofs because it's one roof covering 5 homes, and it would be too difficult for one owner to maintain a piece of a continuous roof. So the CCNRs will allocate, and the one in Manhattan Beach, that's exactly what it is. The association's responsible for the roof. Now, with tree roots, before I get to tree roots, the exception to that rule that I just told you is A, if the governing documents say the association is responsible if a common element causes damage on a lot. It usually does not say that. It usually says the opposite. An owner is responsible for damage he or she causes to common elements, but it doesn't say the opposite. Or under case law, if the association caused the problem. Well, here, the developer planted the trees 46 years ago. The association probably didn't have an awareness that the roots were growing because they were probably not surface roots, they're probably underground. And if the association took prompt action to either cut the roots that were trespassing onto lots and then put in barriers, I think that the owner will be responsible for repairing their own damages and not the association. Again, keep those two exceptions in mind. The governing documents say otherwise, or the association's at fault. It did something wrong. A growing tree with underground roots is not something wrong until you know that there's a problem. Once you know there's a problem, you're obligated to take action. Now, if the association roots caused damage, the owner could certainly try to get coverage under their owner's insurance policy, or they could pay it themselves. There's some case law out there that says, these aren't condos these aren't apartment buildings where the landlord takes care of all the damage. When you own a home, you're responsible to maintain and repair it, whether it's from wind or rain or tree roots. And it's not necessarily an association responsibility. If it was, then your assessments would be much, much higher because you'd have to put money away for these unanticipated damages that come up from like tree roots. Now, that being said, if the whole community has trees that are similar, it makes sense to have an arborist go out and survey and look at all the other trees to see if there's damage to other homes that could be avoided. Because now the association is on notice of a potential problem. But I don't, again, having not read the governing documents for this particular community, it would be my response that the general rule is that the owner is going to be responsible for repairs of their own lot, while the association must take appropriate action to stop the roots from growing and possibly to remove the roots. Does that make sense? Okay.
Nice.
Okay, so in that case, it was a PUD, 171 homes, I guess it was. So yeah, I would basically have an arborist go around and look around to make sure that there are not other instances that you can avoid now, either by the placement of tree roots or by removing certain offending roots or certain trees. I mean, sometimes the whole tree has to go because it wasn't properly selected for that location. Sometimes a builder's not thinking 46 years into the future and where will the roots grow. Today's standards, they would think about that kind of stuff. Okay, let's go on. Simon, you have any other question or should I go on?
I think we can move on to the next topic, please.
Okay, so let's talk about financial obligations of an association. And there are quite a few. Let's start with the reserves. So California law says that every 3 years, the association has to commission what's called a reserve study. And a reserve study is performed by someone who's trained and in some states licensed to perform a reserve analysis and then to publish a report. And that report will list every major component of the common area. It will list its remaining useful life. It will tell you how much it's going to cost to replace or do major repair. Then it will compare how much money you have set aside in your reserve account and tell you you are over budgeted, you're right on point, or you're under budgeted for all of these replacement and repairs over the next 30 years. And they're going to give you a chart for 30 years. It's going to show each year, oh, we're behind 15%, we're behind 20%. I spoke with a board member earlier today. Their reserve account should have had $500,000. They had $300. That would be deemed to be a breach of fiduciary duty because even a small bit of damage cannot be repaired with the $300, and the association wouldn't have the funds to do so. What if the road sewer under the road failed? Well, that could be tens of thousands of dollars to fix if it's a public street. So getting a reserve study is very, very important. And then that reserve study needs to be reviewed annually because what if an unanticipated repair occurred? So the reserve study may say, oh, you got to replace the front gate in 5 more years, but it fails this year. Well, you need to have the money in a pooled reserve account to pay for that. Now, that's a good segue into the next obligation, and that's bank accounts. The association must have at least two accounts. One is called the operating account, and one is called the reserve account. The operating account pays your day-to-day bills, your electric, your insurance, your management fees, your repairs and maintenance, your landscaper, whatever the case may be. The reserve account is designed to address the issues that we just discussed. It's based on the reserve study, and what the reserve study recommendation is what you're supposed to have in the reserve account. So you see all these obligations. One, you got to have a reserve study. Number two, you have to have an operating account. Number three, you have to have a reserve account. And number four, you have to fund the reserve account. Well, how do you do that? Well, the board has the power to impose assessments. It has to publish a proposed ballot. Everybody gets to see it, and then they vote on the budget, not the ballot, the budget. And if the budget is approved, then that budget includes the portion that goes into the reserve account. And you may have to do a catch-up assessment, a special assessment, in order to, if you are woeful, if you have $300 in that account, and you should have 500,000, you're not going to build it up a few bucks at a time. You're going to need to do a special assessment and fund it fairly promptly because you must have that money set aside. Now, some communities don't have a lot of common areas. So the amount of their total reserves may be relatively small. If you're a community with just a little median landscape strip, that's a lot different than a high rise with elevators and heaters and coolers and all that goes with that, laundry rooms and things like that. So that's what the reserve study, why it's so important. You need to know what your possible financial obligations are. And you must do a reserve study. And that will also, by doing it and then funding it, you're minimizing, as board members and officers, your personal exposure to liability. Now, anybody can be sued for anything, but whether you're going to lose or not is going to be dependent upon your compliance with the law. The next thing relates to the size of your budget. If your budget is below $75,000, every year you have to have what's called a compilation of your finances. A CPA has to look at it and make sure nothing smells bad. If you're over 75,000, then you may have to either have a CPA review or in some cases an audit, a formal audit to ensure that your funds are where they're supposed to be, that they were used for the right reasons. And as fiduciaries of the association, board members are obligated to do this. It's never an appropriate response to say, we're a small association, we don't have enough money, we're not going to do this. No. If it's a small association, you accepted upon purchase, and everybody there accepted upon purchase, the obligations of properly maintaining it and operating it. And it may be expensive to operate, and that's going to hurt your values. But if you keep it properly maintained and repaired, that bolsters property values and the desirability of your community. So, you know, you got to do these kinds of things. Um, all right. So then let's go into state filings. Every year, if you're a corporation, you have to file this, I believe it's called a statement of information with the Secretary of State's office. And that tells the government who your directors are, who your agent for service of process is. That's who gets handed the lawsuit if you're sued. Most associations have their manager act as the agent for service of process. Not always, but sometimes they offer that service. Typically, there's a small fee for that, but they're there to receive all your official mailings. Um, so that is you got to do that. Small associations skip these steps. They don't even know often that you have to file with the state. They don't know you have to do a reserve study. They don't know that you have to have meetings and elections and buy certain insurance. Now, I think next I'm going to talk about insurance actually. So, insurance is a big one. First, because it has become very, very expensive, particularly after the fires. A lot of the insurance, some of the insurance companies left the state entirely, leaving the pool of insurance companies fairly small. And there are communities that have double, tripled, and quadrupled their insurance premiums in the last year or two. And there's no answer to that. You can't go without insurance. And what kind of insurance are we talking about? We're talking about casualty and property insurance. So a few communities in the Palisades called me because they burned down entirely condo projects. Well, they do have insurance. It may not be enough, and that raises all new issues, but you got to have property and casualty insurance. You also have to have liability insurance in case the association is sued. So you have to make sure that both the association and the directors and officers have a separate policy called the directors and officers policy. These are what's going to protect you from lawsuits, especially in a small community that doesn't have enough money to pay your attorney. Now you have the insurance company paying your attorney. You also have to have fraud insurance or a fidelity bond in case you have crooked people running the show and they steal your money. Now, I will tell you that on the liability side, if an association, even a 2-unit association, doesn't have at least $2 million of liability insurance, then those directors can be personally named. They will not be protected if the community is sued and you're underinsured. So it's very important that any community with less than 100 units has $2 million of general liability coverage. Bigger communities, probably bigger insurance premiums. I mean, insurance policy coverages. All right, let's talk about briefly some examples where smaller communities have a unreasonable, in my opinion, burden to comply with the state law. So we talked about already insurance. We talked about inspectors of elections. We talked about meetings and ballots and things like that. We talked about reserve funding, but now you have to have a reserve specialist. That's a couple of $1,000 to prepare that report. But now there's some laws that have come out, such as one called SB 326, and that's known as the balcony law. And what happened was there was an apartment building, not a HOA, but an apartment building in Berkeley. And there were students. My daughter went to Berkeley, so I'm very familiar with Berkeley. But the students were on a building that was only on a balcony of a building that was 3 or 4 years old. It was a new building. But unknown to them, there was dry rot already. And the balcony collapsed and students died. So the state pretty quickly passed a balcony inspection and repair law that applied to apartments. And then the following year, they expanded that to include condominiums and townhouses, anything with three or more units that are over, I think, 6 feet high, wood frame construction. And that is the association's responsibility. If an owner maintains their balcony, maintains the repairs, then this law doesn't apply. But if the association does, you have to, the deadline's already passed, so you better hurry up if you fall in this group. But you have to bring in an engineer or an architect to do a visual inspection that will give that person a 90%, 90 or 95% certainty in their findings. They have to red tag build that balconies that may be unsafe. They will give a report, and the association must immediately start repairs. So the cost of the inspections could be tens of thousands of dollars in bigger communities, less and smaller. But the cost of the repairs, if you don't have those reserves that we just talked about, everybody's going to get a very large special assessment. There's one community that I used to represent in West Hollywood where they had to do a $300,000 per unit assessment. Could you imagine that happening? And in Florida right now, after the building collapsed in Florida, they passed a law that all buildings have to be inspected. It's not just the balconies, it's the entire buildings, and repairs and upgrades have to be undertaken. And all of the seniors who moved, the senior citizens who moved to Florida to live this inexpensive life in their $200 and $300 condos are getting special assessments that they could never pay on their fixed income. And this Florida real estate market is crashing because nobody wants these places. They're going to be money pits. So the balcony inspection law could be a huge burden, not in the PUD that I was answering the questions for, but in an HOA with condos or townhomes. It could be an incredible burden. And that's another reason why the reserves should be properly funded. I'm trying to say, I think I've covered most of the highlight issues. Are there other topics you want me to cover? And today's topic was primarily about the burden on small associations, but if you have other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I think, Matthew, actually, one of the questions that I was trying to ask was, obviously you talked about the insurance premium rising. Obviously, in communities, if they're underfunded with the reserves, they have two choices, right? They can either do special assessment or HOA loans. Could you just kind of like help our communities, whether they're, small or big, whether kind of like your guidance on special assessments versus HOA loans?
Okay, there's actually three answers. One is the special assessment, and that's the most common. And it might fall under what's called an emergency assessment, which does not require the approval of the membership. It's something, and there's under the civil code, there's a few definitions of what an emergency is, and this would probably pass under one of those definitions to fund your insurance premiums. The second, and so you would basically do an emergency special assessment, but you got to get the payments pretty quickly. When you do special assessments, sometimes people drag along payments. So unless you get a payment plan on your insurance where you just pay a little at a time, you may run into a period where you don't have the money because people haven't paid it quickly enough. Okay, the second is you borrow from reserves. It's not my first choice. It's not even my second choice because you need the reserves for the reasons that we just talked about. So in an emergency, however, this money is sitting there, so you don't have to wait for payments. And then what you would do is at the same time impose a special assessment to replenish the reserves. You see? So the board would meet, they'd have a resolution, they deem it an emergency, the unexpected cost increases in premiums, that we're going to lose our coverage. You got to have insurance to satisfy the law and for good management practices. And you can borrow and then have a repayment plan in place to replenish the reserves. The third, which I really don't like either, is where you get a bank loan. And I'm dealing with a community in Bakersfield right now where that's exactly what they want to do. They want to borrow money to do some repairs and to fund the reserves. Now, because the reserve account has to be safe, money isn't invested in that account. It's deposited. So you buy certificates of deposit. They're in high percentage savings accounts. It's in liquid and safe vehicles. So you're not getting a lot of interest on reserve accounts. If you borrow the money to fund the reserve account, the amount of interest you're going to pay on that loan exceeds the amount that you're earning on the reserve account. And that could be, then you have to pay back. Remember, you have to pay back the money. So if you borrow it, you still have to do a special assessment to pay back the bank. Um, and it's not like you go to the bank and tomorrow they give you the money. This process could take months. In my opinion, it's better off just doing the special assessment rather than borrowing it because of the costs of borrowing and the lost opportunity of having to pay more interest than you're earning for the same reserve funds. But some communities do that. To me, not the most prudent of choices. I think I put that. I take back what I said, and I put the borrowing from reserve second, and I put a bank loan third. All right.
Makes
What
sense.
other questions?
Awesome. Um, actually, I guess, Matthew, the one of the things I guess that we could kind of address, and this kind of pertains to all of the associations actually, is um, obviously there are going to be some owners that are going to be delinquent. So what strategies or what can the board members do to kind of effectively or legally manage them?
Okay. So the law, first of all, you have to comply with the law fully. And to do that, there's certain, I'll throw out a few of the laws. If someone doesn't pay assessments, the association has the right to place a lien on the property. And if it's still not paid, the right to foreclose. But that right is contingent upon the debt being at least $1,800 or 1 year delinquent. But so let's say somebody owes less than the 1,800 and it's not 1 year. What could you do? Well, you can offer them a payment plan. That payment plan has to be the same payment plan you would offer other people, has to be fair, and they have to make the payments. If they don't make the payments, then your options are you can sue. You could always sue. Maybe it's small claims court. Nobody really wants to do that, but small claims court is inexpensive and quick. So sometimes that's better. Some communities jump to a collection agency. Personally, I like the collection agencies have their place, but I usually look at them when the debt exceeds the 1,800, because at some point the collection agency cost is going to exceed $2,000 probably. It's $2 to $3 to $4,000. So does it make sense to involve them when $600 is owed or $800 is owed? I don't think so. I think your better option is to either go to small claims court, find a payment plan, or threaten in a kinder way, not use threaten as a word, but that they could be subject to foreclosure down the road if they don't pay. You could also suspend in communities that have amenities such as pools, such as guard gates, such as clubhouses and gyms. You could suspend their rights to use these things. And sometimes that's a pretty powerful one, particularly if somebody's doing Airbnb or they have tenants who moved into the community and they wanted to use a pool. Well, they can't use the pool. Now the tenant is going to be on the back of the owner to do what they need to do before the association makes things worse for the tenant. The owner could also request a meeting with the board. And if that occurs, the board must meet in a timely fashion with the owner. And typically what's discussed is they'll give you a hardship story and they'll want to talk about payment plan, but you can't stretch it too far. The association needs its assessments to pay its bills. So you can't say, okay, you could pay this $500 over the next 3 years. That's not reasonable because the longer you give them, the less likely they're going to pay. It sounds opposite, but it's true. So the better thing is to give them two or three payment opportunities. Maybe 6 months to pay it all if it's a significant amount, 3 months if it's a lesser amount. But at the same time, they have to stay current with their present assessments. You don't want them falling behind the present ones to pay the past ones. They have to pay them all.
I think we
Okay.
have a final question, and I think we can just close off. What should the board members do if the HOA doesn't have reserves but operates with two-member board? I think
Well,
you kind of talked about it briefly in the beginning, but maybe you can kind of just wrap it around just for our board members again.
right. With the two-member board, that's only okay if the bylaws call for three members on the board, because then you have a quorum. If the bylaws call for five or more members, those two board members legally can't do anything other than possibly appoint a third board member. So those two have to be very diligent in going through the community to find a volunteer. If there's no, but going to the reserve question, you must have reserves. That's not even a question. Usually the question is how much. So the answer is absolutely. It's in black and white. You must have a reserve account. You cannot commingle the reserves and the operating. They have to be separate accounts, and you have to base the funding on a reserve study. So I would, to the anonymous attendee, I would certainly put those processes in place. Then Kirk Gentry asked, we have a pending foreclosure on a PUD, considering updating the lien first to include current unpaid dues and costs since it's due to expire. Um, shouldn't we, I assume, update the lien before continuing foreclosure? Um, well, yes. You sometimes the I think there was actually a recent case because in the past, what would happen is the language of the lien would have a specified amount and then say plus X amount per month going forward. And then before the foreclosure, they would get a payoff amount that included all of those extra fees and costs. I'm not sure if that's, I don't do foreclosure work anymore. Usually collection agencies do that, not law firms anymore for non-judicial foreclosures. But again, depending on how much more is owed, it may not make economic sense to update the lien. If they owe another $500, but now you have to have the lien company redo the lien and redo the notices, you're gonna spend more than $500. So if these people aren't paying and it's been at least $1,800 or more than a year, I would go forward with the foreclosure as is, and then just get a paying customer in there, hopefully, who'll pay their assessments as there are incurred.
Awesome. I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Matthew,
My
so
pleasure.
much for the presentation and your great advice to all of our communities, whether they're small, medium, large, whatever. Um, Thank you so much for everything, and thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully, we can see you in the next webinar.
Sorry I talk so fast, but I have a lot to cover.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.